Wildlife by Cynthia DeFelice, Chapter 15. Eric must have slept finally because he awoke to find Quill standing over him, her cool, wet nose nudging his face. She appeared to be fully refreshed after her night's sleep and ready to go. Eric sat up and looked around at the sun rising pink and new, illuminating the ragged wisps of mist that hovered over the land. In the distance, he could see a deer walking cautiously along a line of trees looking for a place to bed down during the heat of the day. Off to the west somewhere, a pheasant cackled. Now that he was learning to look and to listen, this place that had at first appeared lifeless to him was bustling with activity. He and Quill had to get moving too. They couldn't risk staying in one place too long, and they had to keep moving steadily farther from where they'd started in the event that a search party had been called out. From his pack, Eric took out peanut butter and crackers for breakfast. He smeared peanut butter on a cracker and handed it to Quill. Too late, he realized this was a mistake. The peanut butter stuck the cracker to the roof of her mouth. Looking embarrassed, she smacked her tongue again and again, trying to get it loose. Eric choked back his laughter and made little sandwiches with the peanut butter inside the crackers after that. Soon they had emptied the jar and finished the crackers, and after Eric ate the last apple, Quill crunched happily through the core. His stomach still felt empty, and he spent a moment recalling the eggs Oma had fried for him the morning before, their edges crispy, and the ham salty and chewy, and the toast dripping with butter and topped with raspberry jam. He pushed himself to his feet. Enough of that. It was time to pack up and go, time to find his own food. It was then that he made a discovery that it's impossible to get a dog to drink if she doesn't feel like it. He filled the bowl with water for Quill, but she only took a few quick licks. He tried to make her have more, pointing to the bowl, stirring the water with his finger and saying, water, so tasty," reminding her how thirsty she'd been the day before and how sorry she was going to be later. But in the damp coolness of the morning, she wasn't interested. He gave up and drank as much as he could hold, then filled the canteen. "Okay, Quill," he said as they started off, heading once again south. "Today is the day. You're going to find the birds, and I'm not going to miss." For several hours Eric moved carefully in Quill's wake, observing her body language. Over and over in his mind he rehearsed what he would do when she went on point. He'd readied his gun and walked slowly forward, mentally prepared for a bird to flush at any second. When it went up, he'd wait for that moment. When it seemed to hang in the air, lift his gun, sight down the barrel, and swing from behind in the direction it flew. He was beginning to wonder if Quill's points on the previous day had been flukes when it happened. She began sniffing intently, moving quickly down a hedgerow, her tail going faster and faster. Eric laughed, thinking she almost sounded like a snuffling pig as she snorted in huge nosefuls of scent. She worked her way to where the hedgerow ended in a field of cut grain. In his mind's eye, Eric saw the birds moving along in front of Quill, remaining in the safety of the brush, until suddenly they were forced into the open and pshoo! Into the air went a rooster, blam, 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 and another, blam, blam, and then 4 hens. And to Eric's astonishment and joy, this time one of the roosters fell. Quill retrieved it and brought it to Eric. She sat before him proudly holding it, and when he extended his arm she dropped it gently into his hand. It was obvious that Mike Duvichin had trained her well, but Eric refused to let himself think about that. He was struck by the simple beauty of her doing so perfectly what she had been born and bred to do. "Good girl, Quill," he hollered. "We did it! We did it! Yahoo!" He set the bird and the gun down carefully with the safety on. Then, unable to restrain himself, he pounced on Quill and they rolled together on the ground in a gleeful celebration. After several moments of this, Quill rose and shook herself. She spit a few stray feathers from her mouth and looked around sheepishly, as if hoping no one had witnessed this undignified display. Then Eric picked up the bird, smoothed its feathers, and held it up to the light to admire its beauty. The head, with its bright red mask and green and purple feathers, was magnificent. There was a perfect white ring around its neck. Depending on how the light struck them, the iridescent body feathers changed to include every color in the rainbow. The breast feathers delicately tipped in black, shaded from rust to gold to amber, purple, and blue-green. The tail feathers, well over a foot long, were striped with black and brown. The bird's head flopped heavily to the side, and Eric, suddenly aware of the finality of what he had done. Holding the limp, warm body that had been so full of life just moments ago, he was flooded with a powerful remorse. The bird had hatched from an egg, been raised by a mother, and survived despite brutal weather and the sharp watching eyes of hawks and owls and coyotes. Now it was dead, and he had killed it. The enormity of this settled upon him, and the exhilaration of a moment before, mixed with regret. He felt as if he, Quill, and the pheasant had each played a part in a scene as ancient and natural as the earth itself. Still, he couldn't help feeling sorrow about it, even as he was grateful for the meat and proud of his and Quill's accomplishment. Before he put the bird in his pack, he whispered a thank you to it. Some day, he knew, both he and Quill would die too. Would their bodies then nourish plants or grass that would allow a creature such as a pheasant to live? He hoped so. These thoughts were new for him, and he continued to mull them over as he and Quill walked on. They ate the remaining cookies for their lunch. It was the last of their civilized food. That night, they would eat from the land. Mindful of the need to camp near water, Eric began to look for a suitable spot. Quill's tongue was dragging again by the time they found a large pothole with cattails growing on the west edge and some scrubby brushes on the east. The water wasn't too gross looking, at least not until Quill charged into it to drink and cool herself off. That was okay, Eric thought. He could go around to the other side to get water, then boil it once he had a fire going. A dead poplar tree that looked as if it had been hit by lightning stood bravely in the middle of the grassland. Some of its branches littered the ground, and others were easily within Eric's reach. They were perfect for firewood, which was good because he was starving and eager to cook and eat his first wild bird. Taking it from his pack, he held it up in the late afternoon light and admired it once again. He had to clean it now, he knew that. He had to pluck it and gut it and prepare it for cooking. For a moment, he panicked. I have no clue how to do this. Then he told himself to relax, think, and proceed logically. First, the tail feathers. He pulled them out, tied them with a long blade of prairie grass, and put them in his pack for a keepsake. Then, holding the bird in his left hand, he plucked handfuls of soft feathers from the breast. He was relieved to discover how they were much less tenacious than the stiff tail feathers and came out fairly easy, leaving behind the wrinkled, pinky yellow skin. He worked his way down the legs to the spurred and scaly feet, then down the back. Quill found this very interesting and dove into the piles of feathers, coming up with several stuck to her nose, then approached to sniff the bird intently. If you think it smells good now, Quill, you just wait until it's cooked, Eric told her. The bird, naked except for its feathered head and wings, didn't look quite as noble as it had before. It was also a lot smaller than he had imagined, with much less meat on it than on the chickens his mom brought home from the supermarket. It sort of reminded Eric of the scrawny rubber chicken Patrick had given him for a gag gift on his birthday. He smiled, thinking how amazed Patrick would be if he knew Eric was hunting on his own in North Dakota with his own bird dog. The smile quickly faded, though, when he realized it was time to get down to the real work of cleaning the bird. With his Swiss Army knife, he cut off the head, following with the wings and the feet. He remembered Patrick's dad talking about checking the bird's crops to discover what they'd been eating. This would reveal the kind of habitat they'd been frequenting. He cut into the base of the throat, and there it was, the gizzard. Mr. Holt had explained that food the bird ate stayed there for a while, getting ground up by the action of the gizzard and small stones the bird ate. Then it could be more easily digested. Inside the transparent membrane, Eric could see the yellow of wheat. That made sense. He cut it open to see what else might be there, and to his surprise he found the shiny black bodies of crickets. He wasn't sure what this information meant exactly, in terms of finding more birds, but he thought it was very interesting. Quill seemed to think so too. There was no more postponing it. He took a deep breath and sliced into the belly below the breast, exposing the guts. They were slimy and disgusting looking, and were already stinky. He recalled Mr. Holt saying he always field dressed his birds, removing the innards immediately so they didn't contaminate the meat. Next time he would do the same. He removed the guts and carried them off into the grass a ways. Quill followed at his heels. "No," he told her. "Wait for the meat." Then he rinsed the bird as well as he could in the pothole. It was time to get the fire going. He searched the brush until he found 2 fairly large rocks and placed them about 6 inches apart. Then he piled some dry grass between them and put sticks over the grass. "The mess kit pot," he said over the wood, edges perched on the rocks. "Perfect." He filled the pot with water from the side of the pothole neither he nor Quill had disturbed, set it back on the rocks, and lit the fire. While he waited for the water to boil, he found a fairly stout stick, sharpened the end, and skewered the bird with it. He placed the bird over the fire to the side of the pot. Eric had been so intent on his preparations that he hadn't noticed that Quill had disappeared. He called her, and she returned quickly, looking guilty and licking her chops. "Yuck, Quill," said Eric. "You ate those guts, didn't you?" She sat gazing off into the distance, the picture of innocence, and Eric laughed. "I guess a pioneer dog would have done the same thing, huh, girl?" he said. "Nothing gets wasted, right? Well, they're all yours. You don't have to feel guilty about not sharing." The sun was sinking fast, and Eric was glad he'd started early to make camp. The unfamiliar task of cleaning the bird had taken much longer than he'd realized. He set out the plastic bag for his ground cloth, unrolled his sleeping bag, and got organized while there was still light to see by. Then he and Quill sat by the fire, waiting for the water to boil and the bird to roast. He had been hungry and thirsty before, but never anything close to the way he was feeling now. His eyes were riveted on the pot of water and the bird. Nothing seemed to be happening. He wished he'd started the fire under the water earlier. When he stuck his finger in the pot, it was barely warm. What the heck? He wondered. How long does it take to boil water anyhow? At home it would have taken a few minutes on the stovetop or in the microwave. He added more wood to the fire and blew on it. The flames blazed higher. He put the lid on the pot. Maybe that would help. After a while the water began to steam ever so slightly, but the bird didn't seem to be cooking at all. The skin was still pale, not even close to turning a crispy brown. The water steamed and steamed, but never came to a real boil. Afraid it would all disappear before it got fully hot, Eric took the pot off the rocks and set it in the grass to cool. He knew he had to drink some of the water tonight. People could live without food a lot longer than they could survive without water. He thought drinking enough must be especially important, with all the walking he was doing in the dry prairie air. He rearranged the bird over the fire and concentrated on it as the stars came out and his stomach growled. Quill half napped beside him. Her eyes were closed, but her nose twitched at the smell of cooking meat that was finally wafting her way. Eric's own eyes felt heavy, but much more than sleep. He wanted food. At one point, he must have nodded off, though, because he snapped awake to see that the exposed ends of the spit had burned through and the bird had fallen into the fire. He pulled it out. The skin on one side was scorched, and the entire thing was covered in fine film of ash. But it smelled wonderful. Finally, when he could stand waiting no longer, he put the bird on the mess kit plate. It didn't look quite like the perfectly browned birds on the platter in the photo in Dan's shoebox, but to Eric's famished eyes it looked utterly delectable. He carved off half the meat and put it in Quill's bowl, but held it away from her to allow it to cool a bit. I know, he told her. "It's hard to wait, but you don't want to burn your tongue." And then they ate. In his former life, Eric would have called part of the meat raw, and part of it he'd surely have told his mother was burned. He would undoubtedly have complained about the pellets in the meat from the bird shot, But now he barely noticed these things. To him the bird tasted of the prairie. It was smoky and rich and wild. By comparison, store-bought chicken was tasteless, boring, dull. Wild pheasant was the finest food there was, no doubt about it. Quill seemed to agree. When Eric had finished the meat, he chewed and sucked on the bones before handing them to Quill to polish off. All too soon, there was nothing left. Eric licked his fingers for every last smidgen of flavor, then sat back with a sigh of contentment. This contentment didn't last, however, as he almost immediately realized that he was still hungry. Very hungry. He knew Quill had to be hungry too. Well, he'd just have to try to fill his belly with water. He examined the pot. The water looked pretty clear. There were just a few specks of something that had sunk to the bottom. Were the pioneers afraid of a little dirt? Did they have time to stop and boil their water every time they were thirsty? It seemed unlikely. What about when they were being chased by Indians? Eric looked at Quill, who was lapping happily from the pothole. He poured water into his cup and drank deeply, again and again, then let out a loud belch. He felt he and Quill had done well. But he knew they were going to have to do much better if they were going to make it. That's the end of the chapter 15. See you next time for 16.